Hello and welcome to Days of Learning podcast. I'm your host, David Nelson, and I am absolutely thrilled to have my guest, Eric Collins-Dyke from Milwaukee County Housing here with me today. Good morning, Eric.
Good morning, David. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh man, it is a joy for you to come on the Days of Learning podcast. We've been friends for a long time, colleagues in this space of housing and health, and I'm just thrilled to get a bit of time with you today. Hey, Eric, where are you today?
So I am actually at Clare Hall, which is one of our isolation facilities for when COVID started for individuals on the street or experiencing homelessness, dealing with COVID in various stages. On this beautiful Friday morning. Yeah, it's a beautiful property out here.
Man, I'm so glad to talk. We'll talk about where you are and about Clare Hall. But let me tell our listeners and our people who watch on YouTube who you are. Eric is the Assistant Administrator of Supportive Housing and Homeless Services at Milwaukee County Housing. He has an undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and he has a graduate degree from Loyola University in Chicago in social work. And he's been in this space of working with marginalized community, people living on the margins, people living on the streets for a number of years. And we're going to get into that. But Eric, I always start with the question, tell us your story about how you got to this place and time in your life.
Yeah, I think it really goes back to my parents being raised in the way that I was. My parents both come from, a very social justice oriented way of living in terms of not only, during the Vietnam era and their involvement with anti-war stuff and sort of questioning things. They really made it a point to make me aware of parts of society that we didn't necessarily see in Madison. Madison is a wonderful place to grow up. I wouldn't replace it for the world, but sometimes you're in a bubble in certain parts of Madison, and having talking over the dinner table is one thing, but being exposed to parts of society that are struggling and surviving and don't have it as well as you was a big part of my upbringing. And so, while I probably didn't realize it at 10, 12, 13, 14 years old, it certainly resonates with me still to this day. So I think that's where I get my baseline. My parents are still very passionate about things. So I think that was sort of in my bones.
I want to ask you, because I love these stories, these origin stories, as I like to call them. What do you remember about being at the dinner table when your parents were doing things like protesting Vietnam War and even telling you about what that meant?
I vividly remember, on a couple of occasions, my mom in particular talking about it, reminiscing when she was in her 20s and sort of like, she's a very gentle woman. I don't think I've ever seen her yell. But getting emotional and so I could tell that meant something. And when you're a kid and you're close to your parent, like if it means something to them, you're like really curious. And she was always pumping literature and books and magazines. She would put political magazines in my Christmas stockings as I got older. As much as I was a normal kid and into sports and cartoons and other stuff, it's something that's always stuck with me. The civic duty aspect as well. Both my parents worked for government for a period of time. My dad for the state and my mom for Dane County. So that public servant aspect resonated with me as well. I think it was in my bones from the start to be oriented to social justice and individuals who are in groups who are marginalized and just being curious and questioning things. And then I went to an alternative high school. I went to public school for a long time and it didn't work out so good. And then I went to Malcolm Shabazz City High School in Madison. And it was a service learning school essentially. So basically the majority of our non-required learning by the state was in the community. So we did everything from around food insecurity, did some stuff at homeless shelters in Madison. And this is when I was 15 or 16, 17 years old. So really got exposed to some of that stuff and the teachers there as well. So I'm incredibly thankful for my time there.
What do you remember about that, Eric?
Well, I know I was struggling as a teenager, like many teenagers do, and school was not my thing, just to be completely transparent.
Sure.
I don't think it has ever been my thing. But I remember finding a lot of commonality with other students who didn't look like me or didn't come from the same space as me and had many more challenging and complex experiences than I did. But we had sort of a common ground of what we stood for at that point of our life and what we were interested in. And so did the teachers. It was very interesting. They had poetry classes, like history of Bob Dylan, Native American history. But there was this very practical, pragmatic component of serving the community, which I found really interesting. And it was the first time I had sort of done that head first, where I'm not just reading books and talking about it at the dinner table. So that set a good stage for me in terms of what I was interested in.
What do you think? I really want to get into this. I want to unpeel this because there's something about people that get into the space that sometimes for those that aren't in it, think it's all about them. And you said you got into this idea of serving the community, something tangible. What happened?
In terms of
For you?
For me, yeah. I mean, I think, and I still struggle with this, right? Being in government and, bureaucratic context a lot is sort of the hand-to-hand aspect. And you and Max have talked about it before, which has really helped me is the relational aspect between another human being. It's really what it comes down to. I think, a lot of times in certain spaces, people can get lost in policy, and which is vitally important, don't get me wrong, and sort of macro level things and news media. But for me, that really sort of helped me see like, okay, these are the things that I've been reading about, talking about, and seeing on the news. And now I get to see it face to face. And it really sort of helped me not make it about me. I think when you're not in it, you can, especially now with 24/7 news channels and sort of the riffing of opinions that aren't necessarily based in fact, people often who don't do the tangible work seem to be deemed as experts because they have time to sort of pontificate on what's actually happening, but they don't actually know. And so that, what a wonderful, easy sort of way to be if you do it that way. And I just became really interested in everything besides that, especially around, food insecurity. Like when I first sort of started experiencing that, when we did some outreach to food pantries at Shabazz, I was blown away. I mean, the families and children 3, 4, 5 years old. And in a way, I think I felt a little guilt and shame that I had it so easy compared to a large portion of the community that I had often talked about but hadn't met. So it was very humbling. And I think it's sort of what drove me into, sociology first and then social work in school. But also just trying to help where I could, because I know I wasn't going to be a PhD student. I know I wasn't going to, go to, some top-notch school for policy or a think tank or anything. So I just tried to find my niche and get started. I knew it was something that I wanted to do. And I never got weird or like so egotistical where it's like I had to do it or anything. Like
Sure.
It was like innate in me. It just felt very natural.
Well, and as I hear the story, and I've known you for a long time, and I'm learning new things about you. Maybe it's the right combination of your parents, your upbringing, your mom putting political magazines in your stocking at Christmas. That's an image. to, struggling. And for those of us that have struggled either emotionally and or financially, it gives us a different level of insight, and it doesn't become I'm going to save the world, because I think at 17 it's easy to say that I can save the world if these adults have messed it up, but realizing that this is a larger issue than any one individual, or going the other way of saying, which we hear regularly, why don't you people pick yourselves up and go get a job, right?
Mhm. No, absolutely. I mean, it's, I think you're spot on. And I think, um, the more real world experience I got, the less and less interested I got in the academic version of what that world was. Don't get me wrong. I'm wildly intrigued by policy and sort of system change. That. I mean, it's a big part of what I do now. But again, I feel like our conversation prior to this recording is a good example. Like sometimes that stuff doesn't trickle down to the street and to the need. And I've always tried to make sure I have somewhat of a balance of that, even if I'm in jobs that make that difficult sometimes. So,
You know what, as I, in my position as a researcher, it sometimes is easy to sit behind the computer as opposed to being on the streets to learning. You can read about these in books. As my colleague and friend Saeed Ahmed says, you can read about in books, but until you do it, you really are really not quite there yet. And I think that you'll always lead by the example of doing, being on the streets, being at Clare Hall, but at the same time, being on fire for ridiculous policies
yes,
that exist. And,
absolutely.
and we're going to get into this because you said, you're in government and you're relational. Wait, those don't necessarily go together. I thought government was about transactions. So we'll speak to that a little bit later.
For sure.
Um, so you went to undergraduate at UWM.
Mhm.
How did you begin in a professional sense in this area of working for community?
Really sort of by a sort of twist of luck, honestly. I had originally went to undergrad. I wanted to be a special education teacher. And so I spent my first few years working towards that, getting the credits, and also working at a local high school as a special ed assistant. Um, and it's funny because I knew about after a week or two being at the school, I wanted to switch to social work because most of my interactions were with the school social worker, because I worked with a lot of the students who were very functional, but had many behavioral challenges in terms and also just really big difficulties in academics. And so I essentially became a tutor for a lot of them. And most of them were assigned either due to their home situation or stuff happening in school to the school social worker, who was this brilliant woman. And I was just so intrigued by how what she did sort of permeated all the spaces that they were dealing with. It wasn't just about like their history class or their English class. It was about, home life, not having enough food to eat, helping their parents get health insurance, all other kinds of resources. So I was just really taken aback by it. And then I sort of switched to sociology because I was very into, like you said, I was, and I still am. But at that point in my early 20s, on fire about some policy stuff, and it was great. Undergrad was wonderful. And then after that, I needed a job. That was, I was at that point I was done with special ed, and I love it. I have the utmost respect. They're true heroes, special education teachers. They really are. But I responded to an ad. I believe it was on Craigslist at the time. this was for the guest house. This was in 2006 or 7, I want to say. Interviewed and never worked with the homeless population before. And I think they just really needed somebody. And I was somewhat enthusiastic, I think. And they hired me to be a case manager for one of their new housing programs called HomeLink, which is now manifested into a really cool program. It was a sort of a pilot project back then. And my first day, they sort of threw me in there, and I'll never forget, James Shante, rest in peace. He was a case manager for HomeLink, a formerly homeless individual who had stayed at the guest house, who they hired, and he mentored me. And we were complete opposite. I was a 26-year-old Caucasian man from Madison, Wisconsin, and James was, I believe, 62 or 63, African-American man from the South who then lived in Milwaukee. And it was wonderful, man. I'll never forget, so they had you interview with the administration, which was like really pretty chill. And then they had you interview with James and the rest of the staff. And it was an amazing experience. Like they gave it to me real. And I remember he said, and I probably won't get it verbatim, he said, if you're ever in a position doing this job where you help somebody and your immediate reaction is that you feel good about like yourself doing it, like you should get in your head, you're like, all right, I did a good thing. He's like, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. He's like, your job is hand to hand getting these people where they need to be. And not a single aspect of it is about you or how you feel about it. And I was just like, I was like, okay. I'll never forget it. And that was like 13 years ago. And he was one of the best sort of social service providers I've ever seen with not a whole lot of formal training. Him and Ryan Hurst, and Ryan actually works for me now at the county, sort of paved the way for me and showed me around places that I wouldn't have gotten accepted in, or people probably would have not engaged with me like they did if it wasn't for them. So,
it's a really interesting mindset, and we regularly have volunteers, and I'm actually okay with them feeling good about themselves, and or the young people, individuals saying how fortunate they realize, how fortunate they are, how privileged they are. Mm-hmm. But it starts to evolve over time, and if it continues to be about you, especially as you get into the job, you won't last, and you'll burn out if nothing else, or you'll become so egotistical that you think you know what those people need, without the realization of moving towards what they may need from their perspective.
For sure.
I was struck by you applied for a job through Craigslist.
Yeah, man, this was like this is when the cell phones were still big, I feel like. And I didn't know what I was doing. A quick story. So like I had worked prior to that because I just needed to pay rent for a year at Whole Foods in the seafood department. Knew nothing about seafood. I wore waiters every day. It was one of the best jobs I ever had. And they sort of hired me knowing nothing. And I just, at some point I was like, well, I kind of want to try to get back to what I was doing. And this was one of those. I was like, hey, it's worth a shot. I sort of talked about my passion. I was very upfront that like, I have no experience providing case management or anything in this job description, but I will work really, really hard and as much as you need. And again, it could have been a combination of that, and they just needed to fill the role. Who knows?
I do think that there's something to be said about, again, I'm getting these images today of you, my friend. I love the idea of being a fishmonger, man. Throw me the fish.
My alternative life, I feel like I would be a lobsterman in Maine.
Man.
I just I really love the job. I mean, it wasn't sustainable. It was just, at that point in my life, but I love the guys I work with. So much respect for people who do that kind of work. So I think a lot of that too laid the foundation for me just in terms of hard work and like, you
bring the right attitude, and that's important. You can teach skills, that you can teach skills, but it's the idea of being real. And I think some of my most memorable positions too, my first job in fast food, and my second or third job working in a factory. And I will to this day remember working in the aluminum factory with the guys who did this for a living. And they knew I was a college boy, and I was my brother was the plant manager, and he got me the job. And they tried to school me on what life was like.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome.
So for those who aren't familiar, tell us about Guest House and what role it plays in our social structure.
Yeah, the guest house is a wonderful organization. And I was there, it was quite a bit smaller, but it's an 86 bed men's shelter in the city of Milwaukee that now over the last 15 years, it's expanded into a number of different supportive housing programs. They have an on-site state certified mental health and drug and alcohol clinic with some amazing clinicians who have been there a long, long time. Some of the most dedicated people I've worked with. They have comprehensive community services. They have a recovery program. They have a community garden. I think they've really sort of supplanted themselves in our homeless services system as an agency that is very adept at touching sort of all aspects of the system, and really from a dignified perspective, trying to make sure they have sort of each resource available as the men go through their programs. Where some agencies are just a shelter, and that's okay, they're just a shelter or just a housing program. Guest House and Cindy and her team over there have done a wonderful job at putting together almost an internal flow. Whereas if the system might not have the resource, they've sort of learned to get the resource on their own and make it part of their programming. I think they do a wonderful job of, we've talked about this before a lot, David, where it's not just housing, it's like not just shelter. I even think their motto is like more than shelter now or something. And it's true. It's not hokey, it's real. It's they try to have all this different programming attached to the individual that is more than just, all right, we're going to get you housing as quickly as possible. And I've seen some really profound change from a lot of the men who've come out of there, not just housing, but also with, addiction issues they're dealing with, mental health and stuff like that. So very proud to have worked for them and a huge fan of them still.
We believe that housing is the cornerstone of all things for people, their existence. Without housing, everything else is a house of cards, so to speak.
For sure.
When you can get housing, then you can build upon that foundational piece. But too often, as we've talked about, we stop at the aspect of got your housing, see ya. And we know that those who are out in the street, there's a community out there. And then suddenly this is gone. And it's like they're isolated in this apartment. And it's like, oh, that didn't work out so well for me. I got heat and lights and electricity, but you know what? I don't have community.
Yeah, I think it's a thing that is, the more and more we've really implemented the housing first model over the last 5 or 6 years, we've really tried to take a step back and look at that social isolation piece, especially right after moving in, especially if you've been on the street for a while. And like you said, it's almost, when you're on the streets for a long time, based on, the folks that I've served over my career, is you develop a sense of community out of necessity, and then it becomes essentially almost a brotherhood or a sisterhood. In that, like the house of cards piece, I appreciate you saying it that way, because it really is. And I always try to remind people about this when I'm getting emails from business folks and constituents and county supervisors and angry people, is the survival mode aspect of day to day becomes your routine. And anybody who is used to a routine, I know I have one, I know you have one, when that's shaken up, even if the change in most ways is good, that can throw a curveball to you right away. In that, you're used to waking up and going to the breakfast spot. You're used to going to the space to get bus tickets. You're used to going to the library to use a computer. You have that all set. You're used to being in the shelter at 6 p.m. at night. You're used to going back to your tent right before nightfall so you can find your way through the woods. You're used to seeing this community outreach team on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays. And we have a really good structured resource system in that sense. I feel like, and I think we're slowly moving in the right direction after sort of being stuck, is a lot of times once folks are housed, sort of all those infrastructure things that help someone survive on the street are harder to attain for someone in housing who still needs them. Because what a lot of people don't realize is the majority of folks when we move into our programs still have no income, right? So they're in an apartment, but they still have no income. And so they still need to access these spaces. So it's one thing that I mean, as you know, in some of our conversations over the last year and a half, we're really starting to focus more on and make a big push aggressively too in some of our policy conversations and funding to not just look at the housing piece, but the support piece as well. And I say support and not service because that's what it is. It's more than just service. It's service and all the other needs that they still need once they move in.
It's the evolution of the place in society. We struggle as a system. I think what yours is a good example, but we also talk about the idea of the existence of whether it be families that are on welfare, families that are on food share, or families that are on disability, or the elderly who frankly are living in the same day-to-day existence. And unless you are you have wealth, you are going to struggle.
Yeah, I think inequities are all over, but I think even more so when you talk about homelessness, it's you have the poverty rate and levels of poverty, and then to me you have homelessness, and I think it's the housing piece presents sort of an immediate form of dignity, but then we have to recognize that is then the baseline moving forward. It is not the end all be all. It is someone in housing could still struggle mightily with certain things they were on the street, and sometimes it can be worse when they're in housing because on the street they may have immediate support in terms of the folks they may be staying at the camp with, or under the bridge, or at the shelter with, or they can walk down the hall to their caseworker at the shelter, or upstairs to talk to residential services. And we have some of that at our congregate buildings, but a lot of our programs now, as you know, are scattered site. And so folks are in the community, which is wonderful. They're in the community. But again, the support is not as quick as it once was.
So tell the listeners, you had mentioned the phrase housing first. Take us through an encounter of meeting someone and then moving from that. Does it happen overnight where you go, oh, I meet you, John Smith, on the streets, let's get you an apartment?
No, yeah. I mean, I think we would all agree that it takes too long. And I think we're constantly trying to figure out ways, and sometimes we're beholden to landlords and the way the voucher system works. No, it's really, I mean, I think our initial contact, at least for outreach team, and again, we've changed a little over the last year or two, and we're still really housing focused, but I think we're becoming much more well-rounded, which I'm excited about in terms of some of our interactions. But no, we'd find John Smith, wherever he's at. We meet him where we're at, is the common term, whether that's the bridge or on the street or on the sidewalk or in his car. We would make initial contact, and we could offer immediate sort of shelter or connection to our outreach services, especially our PATH program. Sometimes, as folks are interested in emergency shelter, and sometimes they're not, and that's just a lot of times based on their sort of what they're going through. It has nothing to do with the wonderful work that the emergency shelters do. It could be related to mental health or addiction or what have you. And then we get into the wonderful joy of the cogs of our system and trying to get individuals qualified for various housing programs that are generally based on the length of time that you've been homeless, either in a shelter or on the street, which has to be documented by a third party, which is a whole nother conversation. And then based on, disability status, if you're dealing with mental health, if you're dealing with addiction, if you have a physical disability. And so oftentimes if somebody, based on their history in our homeless management information system that we can collect, and we think that they'll probably qualify for our program, we start the paperwork right away. We do a referral to coordinated entry. 4 years ago, I want to say April 2016, they started doing all the housing through coordinated entry. Prior to that, when you and I met, Stephanie and I were just running around in the van with vouchers. I think about those days a lot.
In some ways, I miss them.
Oh, me too. No, me too, man. We talk about it at least like once a week over here. In fact, we were talking about it now because we have sort of some stagnation using some of our vouchers. And Jessica was like, can we just go back to Eric and Stephanie in the van? It's like, but anyway, yeah. So we would then get them qualified through the CE system, get them assigned to a voucher. And so if they're assigned to ours, it's a housing first voucher. And so we have rental subsidy, and we're not creative with names, so we just call it a county housing first program. And then, yeah, we would assign them a housing navigator. They would look for apartments anywhere in the county that would, take our vouchers that work with us. We try as much as we possibly can to figure out where the individual wants to live and see if we can find a place in that area. And then when they move in, they're assigned a housing first case manager through our program specifically that's funded through the county. Furniture is provided, not as much as we would like, as you know. And then they move in. And sometimes, like, this is the thing, sometimes it can be really quick. And sometimes that's awesome, where like the landlord's like, all right, we're ready on Monday. And sometimes that's really difficult, especially if somebody's, been on the street for a while. They have a lot of stuff, they're pretty entrenched in what they're doing. And then once they're in, they set a service plan with their case manager. They sort of talk about their needs. They sort of collaboratively figure out the best way to move forward. There's not a billable aspect to the case management we have in our program, which is kind of nice, and that a lot of the case management can be a little more holistic. I will say too, and it's one thing that's important for people to recognize, and much respect to all the case managers out there, is that our caseloads are wildly high. And so, we have them at 20. And just if I can give you a lens, most people in the system are like, oh my gosh, that's low, but it's really high. It should really be 1 in 8, 1 in 10 at the most. And so oftentimes, for those first few weeks, first month or two, the clients will reach back out to the original outreach worker they were working with, our housing staff who may know them pretty well, just for some extra support, because they were so used to the support on the street in various ways. I think sometimes we have this and I'm guilty of it too, we have this sort of unconscious reaction. Well, now that they're in housing, the need isn't as great.
Sure.
And oftentimes it's greater. So, yeah.
Yeah, that there's a phenomenon that's well documented in the literature that once people get housing, they sort of get worse before they get better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Eric, tell us, because people want to know, what do you notice about, what are some of those things that are associated with homelessness in your experience?
It's really interesting because I think I think you have a good percentage of the folks that we serve on the street that have dealt with serious trauma in their life, whether it's recent or in childhood. Childhood trauma always comes up. It just does. I mean, I know that's generalized, but I think you probably agree with that, at least the majority. At some point in their life, something happened that was traumatic.
Unresolved trauma.
Unresolved trauma. That's a great way to say it. Unresolved trauma. That is so deep and so gnawing and so complex that a lot of times it sort of is the weight that they're carrying day to day. Addiction and mental health for sure are huge in a lot of the folks we see on the street. I think the combination of both we're seeing more in the last few years. The mental health issue has always been there. We have some really difficult laws that we work within that make it very difficult to sometimes serve the sickest on the street, for lack of a better term. But I would say the combination of that and addiction are really at the forefront right now, at least in our community. I feel like are really standing out. I will also say, and you and I have talked about this before, we run into a lot of people who aren't necessarily dealing with any of that, and it's an economic issue. I can't tell you the number of people I've run into since I've been doing outreach over the years who previously had a job where they made $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year, and for whatever reason, and I think it just shows you how flimsy some of the safety nets are, where you can end up on the street. So it's a mix. I always try to tell people, like, I know there's this sort of stereotype of the homeless population, but, and you probably see it too with your volunteers, especially, their first few times, some of the folks we run into, I think Max says it all the time. We're a lot more alike than we are different.
For sure.
And it's true. Like, it really is. I mean, especially with COVID, we've run into a lot of people who, it's an economic issue, man. And some of it's related to, I think, the discriminatory policies of job hiring and people's past and stuff like that. But I think beyond the addiction, beyond the trauma, sort of beyond the traditional historic lens of homelessness, it comes down to, we have failed as a country and a society to have that safety net for people falling through the cracks in the richest country in the world. And I think, that's where I still sort of hold the fire for the policy piece, because we have to start holding people accountable, and that there are these people suffering who, if we just had some willpower and some, money flowing in the right direction instead of for the wealthy, I think we could help a lot of folks who are sort of in the shadows and in the gray area of homelessness, who, you don't qualify for this, you don't qualify for that, you're too sick for this, you're not sick enough for that. It's COVID has exacerbated things, and I think the silver lining is making the community understand more of the complexities of homelessness and who experiences it.
This really has to become a social issue, because we don't want government to be de facto. There's a role for government, just as there's a role for faith-based and organizations and individual wealth in this issue.
Yeah.
But when you speak of the economic issues, it really resonates with me, because there's a whole, not category, but a whole community, the lower 1/3 of the those economic status, are at risk for being homeless. And as you had said, COVID and the pandemic has impacted this community so greatly. I will tell people, white collar workers are thriving. We know that, right? Because we have stable housing, we have adequate bandwidth. We can do our work in the comfort of our home. If it gets a little bit cool, I touch the thermometer and it goes up a degree, and I go, "Oh, I feel good, feeling chilled here."
Right.
The community we serve and those just outside of that community don't have that luxury.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think like the 1/3 piece is really important for folks to understand and think about, in that, we often think of poverty in certain ways, and it looks certain ways, and it's in certain areas. And, homelessness, and those experiencing it, especially unsheltered homelessness, I think there has to be a distinction, as especially when you're in a climate like ours, with the various seasons changing, is it's not even survival. It's I feel like, in a lot of ways, we have sort of rendered, that part of the population to just in perpetuity struggle, like, right? I mean, like, day to day, even with some of our housing policies, we can get you in housing, we can get you a rent assistance voucher. If you make too much money, you don't have your voucher anymore, even if you're then going to have to pay 70% of your rent because you make $100 more than what's qualified. So I always appreciate you bringing that up, because I think it's really important for folks to recognize, but also on a policy level too. And I also appreciate you saying government is not the de facto, because you're absolutely right. It's going to take wealthy people to be involved in this, and to, put some money where their mouth is, and have public-private, collaboration.
Which we do a fine job here in Milwaukee, where we have volunteers, we have people that are in position of authority. We work with a variety of people. I want to ask you, because this show is about the learning that we have around health and community and the health space. How does housing impact the health of an individual and their family? What does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like housing as a baseline.
Yep.
Yeah, look, I think anybody who sort of, I think a lot of us take our homes for granted, and don't think about it a lot, but thinking about starting your day, waking up in the morning out of your bed, simple things like going to your own bathroom, brushing your teeth, making your own breakfast in your own space, and think about not having that. Think about waking up with nowhere, the only place to eat is a bus ride or two away. You're in a tent, you're under a bridge, you're in a car, and you constantly have to fight for survival to get basic things. There is no way that you are able to parcel out time to, as folks in certain parts of society say, put on your bootstraps and do things like that, because you're just trying to survive. You're trying to sustain life. Housing, I think, at its core, provides your safe space, your sanctuary, the place where you can be you. And I think I don't think there can be enough said about that, just sort of naturally how it makes somebody feel. I think the dignity aspect as well is so vital to, having that safe space to be able to start to look at healthier ways of living, whether that's the food you eat, whether that's maybe changing people you hang out with that are negative influences related to addiction issues you're going through or mental health. It's a space you can claim as your own. A lot of the things we hear from the folks we serve is, we always have to wait on you. We always have to wait on you. And I think it's a really interesting, and they're right. We've developed a system where it's become so innate that the only resource they can get is from us after a certain amount of time. And so they spend the majorities of their days waiting on us and our schedules and our time to get things, which keeps them stuck. And housing as the platform, we've noticed, has really sort of flipped that on its head in a lot of ways. And that we, in a lot of times, not all the time, once folks move in, you sort of notice this regaining of independence and self-determination, which is
self-efficacy and empowerment.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you, because it's important, and I think it's easy for us to forget about this, the idea of, you said, imagine waking up. You've seen people who wake up with these issues, and many of them have chronic diseases like hypertension, cancer, type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes. Mm-hmm. What's it like for a person in that situation to deal with a chronic illness like that? What have you seen?
I mean, I think, just to be general, it's somewhat we've seen a ton of ingenuity. I think we can't go without saying that. The ingenuity that we've seen for people living on the street is unparalleled and really astounding, and just always increases my respect for the folks that we work with. But I think, especially for somebody who's diabetic, especially for someone who's older with underlying health conditions, maybe having cancer, it's almost an acceptance of the disease and the acceptance that they're not going to be able to have treatment that will provide an intervention that most people would have. And it's not even almost conscious. It's like, I'm on the street, there's no access. It is what it is. I'm just trying to get breakfast, Eric. I don't want to talk to you about, do I have enough insulin to last me for the rest of the week? My blood sugar is low and I need you to take me to the gathering right now. I think that's the balance, is the real-time immediate need, and balancing out how we can talk about long-term health and access to health for folks experiencing that on the street. Because it happens more often than not. We're at a camp that has heavy heroin use in the near south side of Milwaukee, but also had two people with, one had type 1 and one had type 2. And so about half the things we found among the needles, as we were sort of helping people when we were moving them out, was insulin. And as you can imagine, there's no place to store that insulin under that bridge. Little things like that that then affect their long-term health. So not only is it affecting sort of the ebb and flow of their blood sugar that week, if you let that go too long, you start having long-term effects. And when you're on the street, and especially if you're dealing with addiction, your first thought isn't, all right, a lot of the times, I got to get to the clinic and figure out a way to store my insulin. It's, I got to take care of what I'm going to eat that day and take care of my addiction so I don't get sick. I also think, and we've talked about this too, this is a little more general, but it's very important, is that, and this is probably some of our fault in our system too, is a health specific focus for individuals experiencing unsheltered homelessness. You know, not just outreach workers, not just LCSWs, we have plenty of those. But health, people with that expertise doing outreach, and beyond just, you know, taking someone's pulse and checking blood pressure, which are also great and needed, but like really entrenching themselves with the community and the people serving them for long-term health effects, you know, and that can speak to it much better than we can. You know, like I can talk about like, oh, they don't have a refrigerator on the bridge to, you know, store their insulin, but someone in the health space can probably then speak to a much more poignant, like, this is what will happen if they don't take their insulin in 5 days. Which will strike at the core of some apathy, I think, and will strike at the core of some people being like, oh, wow, this is, you know, not like a flip of a switch, but I think those kind of things would really help have us make some progress in the health space around homelessness.
It's a good example of how we deal with it in the acuity of homelessness. And frankly, we know there are people who are not homeless, but they don't have electricity. How are they supposed to store their insulin? Mm-hmm. It's the basic dignity and the health of individual and communities of humans. So I want to ask you, because I'm asking this question to everybody, and look at this. We didn't even get to 2 questions that we wanted to talk about today. Imagine that. But I think we've touched on some important things today. But what would you want those that are involved with the health space to know about what you do and the community you serve?
Oh, I love this question. I mean, what I always say is, and I think a lot of people in the health space are starting to recognize this, is how vital housing is to the overall health of someone beyond just ongoing treatment, you know, from a medical standpoint. I also think, and I've said this many times, as you know, is the health space can be so influential in pushing policies that would mean so much to the homeless community, and accessing resources. And I think what I'd want them to know is we need them. We want them. We want their expertise. We want, you know, we want them to be able to tell us what we're doing wrong, train us, you know, give us advice on things we're overlooking when we're just focused on getting somebody off the street. And I think too, there's some really amazing possibilities in the next few years of combining resources and looking at various levels of policy to incorporate housing into a health need, you know, whether that's funding it through Medicaid and Medicaid waivers, you know, to someday in the utopia of our world, you know, writing a prescription for housing. And I know that sounds kind of out there, but it's true. And I think too, I've been in, you know, last few years, and you invited me to some of these spaces, hearing medical professionals talk about homelessness and some of the underlying effects it has always been so poignant and so interesting to me. And I think it resonates with a lot of us who know nothing about the medical space, who are ignorant of a lot of stuff that doctors are experts at. And I would just say more collaboration. And that's on us too, man. Like that's on us to bring some of that too. And more, oh yeah, I don't want to miss this. You told me, but more frontline collaboration with frontline workers and middle level administrators, not just executives.
Well, we're going to see about we can do that. You had me at a prescription for housing. You had me there. I'm in.
One day, I hope.
The bottom, but I'm diving in. I love that answer. because it does speak to the intersections and the intentionality that needs to exist around this topic.
Mhm.
So, Eric, what would you want the community you serve to know about the health space?
Mm. That's a great question. I mean, I think I'd want them to know how vital that space is to their ongoing movement towards self-efficacy and self-determination, like we talked before. I think a lot of times, again, not to sound like a broken record, that we think housing is sort of the panacea, and once they're in housing, they're good to go. I think having the individuals we serve recognize sometimes early interventions can be so beneficial to potentially long-term negative effects of their health, especially if you've been on the street for a long time and not addressing something now, even though you're fine, could come back to bite you 10, 15, 20 years. And so I think I'd want them to know the importance of that space, the importance of those collaborators, those partners, those agencies, and recognizing the intersection of them moving into housing and getting healthier are so intertwined. And again, I think it's easy for us to say that and tell the folks we serve, but then it's another thing for us to put that plan in action and have the right resources to back that up.
Tell me about a win. Tell me a story.
A win. Oh man, there's been a decent amount lately. I think one of the most recent ones was, and this is not me again, like I don't do as much outreach as I used to, which I missed lately. We had an individual who was in one of the local county parks for a long time, for a year or two, really, really, really sick from a mental health standpoint, unmedicated. Lucidity was not great, but really a sweet guy. And one of our outreach workers essentially has developed a schedule every week to see him at a certain time, talk to him about certain things that they would only talk about. And after a couple months of that, and as it got a little colder, he finally agreed to go into one of our indoor placements with her. And I think I like those wins even a little more than the wins we used to have, where we're just getting people off the street in 2 days. And that I think it speaks to the commitment of the outreach community, but it also speaks to the commitment of that person on the street, that they were allowing that person to come to their space for months without any sort of tangible ending. They were just, eventually it came, but those random Tuesdays and Wednesdays when they were talking, and he's still he's in our Pathways program. And so I think, I think those are things I love to see, because really what that is, it's more than just housing focused outreach. It's person-to-person relational interaction. They developed a relationship of sorts, and eventually on a random Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever it was, they felt safe enough to go in with this person. And so I think, those are really awesome for me. There's also a couple really cool stories about people in housing. I just got a call yesterday from someone who we housed from the old Six and Clybourne encampment, who is now a property manager of the building he lives at.
Right on.
And was calling me to say that they had open units for voucher. It was like, I was just on the phone, like I couldn't even speak for a minute, man. And I was like, I was like, this is amazing. And he doesn't need our voucher anymore because he makes enough money. And that happened yesterday. And that was bizarre and awesome.
And it's rare that we're without words.
That is true, my friend. Yeah.
Oh, I love those stories because it speaks of the commitment, not only on the part of the outreach workers, but on the part of the community. We struggle to understand the contextual issues that people face,
For sure.
the individual medical, psycho, social, trauma, unresolved trauma, addictions, and even chronic illnesses and acute illnesses. We know the issue of, a scrape becomes infected and suddenly you're feverish. And what do we do? But it's the idea of showing up, the idea of caring. It comes down to caring for people who are in a different circumstance than you are. Not better, not worse, but just in a different circumstance. We know there's been my last question for you for today, Eric, is we know that there's a commitment by the government, nonprofits, faith-based organizations to continue to press on this issue. If we keep working in this fashion, take us out 25, 50 years, 100 years, what we're doing now, why does it matter for the future?
Oh, I think in a lot of ways, I think the only way to move forward and to stop having such astounding homeless numbers in the country is to, like you said it, government is not the de facto in this. There is a ceiling to everything because politics are involved, just to be completely blunt. I think that the private space being involved in this has so many interesting possibilities because of the flexibility and creativity of the people in that space and the resources they have to extend to the community that sometimes the government doesn't. And I think we're setting a really good baseline, that I hope carries well beyond, when I'm done with this work, that people are seeing and recognizing the need to leverage resources instead of just the government saying, here's $20 million, we're going to end homelessness. Because I believe that's been tried a few times. And I think I love to see, people in the philanthropic space, people in the healthcare space, people in the business space, really start investing their time and their resources in helping us, because it's, again, there's so many complexities to moving people out of homelessness, staggering often, that you need various resources from different levels of society that are flexible to address the need. Sometimes long-term and sometimes pivoting on a dime, like with COVID. I mean, COVID is a great example, as you know, David, that the private support that's come through COVID has really allowed us to sustain some of the things we've done to keep the community safe and get them indoors. And I would say too, I love the push over the last 5 to 6 years on housing, and I think we'll only keep pushing, and more people than ever, I think, are down and into housing first. They're down with it. They vibe with the policy. I think the support and the sense of community, I hope, in the 20, 25 years for folks in housing looks the way it does in a lot of ways on the street right now. I hope for that, and I hope we're able to put resources and have people with fiery spirits push those policies as much as possible.
You remind me of it reminds me of a conversation that we'll have at a future date, but because there is that notion of how do we, so to speak, move up in the social status, so we have more wins about people who are contributing not only to themselves to others. The idea of a property manager no longer needing the voucher, for example. But there's lots of ways to consider moving up in the idea of giving back to systems. And I can't, of the thousands of people that I have come across, there are very few that say that they don't want to give back once they get the support that they need and to move beyond the day-to-day existence. Eric, you always have a platform with me, and I hope that you'll come back at some point to talk more about how we can change the world one person or one group at a time. Is there anything else that you want to tell the audience at this time?
No, I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate you letting me talk about housing and homelessness in our local area and letting me rant. And I just thank you for having this space to talk about these issues. I think it's so vital and so important.
Eric Collins-Dyke of Milwaukee County Housing, you are a joy. Your dedication shines. And, we wish you continued success in the work that you do, continued health for you and your teams. And please come back and let's talk further about this. Maybe bring a couple of your team members and we'll tell some stories.
I would love that, David. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, my brother, I will see you soon. Take care.
Take care.
What a conversation. I just am just so full of appreciation for the work that Eric and his team does around housing, homelessness, and for those who are experiencing poverty and health. You know, he spoke of that intersection, the idea of someone with diabetes or cancer or mental health issues and housing and waking up in a tent, what that must be like for those individuals. But that there is hope and there are examples of wins that exist so that people don't have to live, exist, and die in a tent. I hope you've enjoyed this Days of Learning podcast. If you have comments, drop us a note. If you like what you hear, subscribe, listen, share, and continue to support the work of connecting health and community engagement. I'm your host, David Nelson, and this is Days of Learning podcast.